All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Monday's Human Anatomy. As you can see, we are finishing up the immune system today and starting the endocrine system. You can see some of your important endocrine organs there. It's funny how much, when you do this stuff a lot, that pictures like this are just totally normal, like pictures of naked people. And I forget that sometimes. I'll tell you a quick, stupid story. Last August, my daughter, who was 10 at the time, had like a pool party with a bunch of friends. We have like a little above ground pool. We have in the summertime, we built this like screen out of an old sheet, and we got a projector to like watch movies in the backyard and stuff. It's pretty sweet. And we had set it up so that her friends could like watch this movie in the backyard on the computer, like after they went swimming and stuff. And so we got everything set up, and they were going to watch an episode of a show or a movie or whatever. And they're all playing the pool. Everything was great. And then they decided, we had everything set up, and we were going to play the movie off my computer, and they decided they wanted to play more before they watched their show. And I was like, oh, great. I got a lecture for, human anatomy and physiology to prepare. I'll just work on that. So I started working on my PowerPoint slides for that, forgetting that it's like on my computer, but it's projected on the big screen as well. And of course, there's like a diagram. It was like the intro lecture. So it was like a diagram, like the human body, and it had like a male and a female, like bodies up. And like the girls were like playing the pool and looked over like, ah! I'm like totally freaked out because there's projecting naked people on the side of the screen. Yeah, so don't do that. Anyway, in advance of class today, you had some readings on the immune system, and I asked you to complete that ideological awareness exit survey. If you haven't done that yet, I included it on your program for Wednesday as well. I think those of you that have done it, how long did it take approximately to finish that? 20 minutes. 10, between 10 and 20, I'm hearing. Okay, yes, it doesn't take that long. Please do that. It's really important. It kind of ties everything together and is data for the whole project of all the work we've done. So please make sure you do that if you haven't already. I know it's a busy time of the semester. I'm going to ask you to do your course evaluation here. I think they open like next week soon too. Have you gotten an email about that? Actually, I don't know exactly what the schedule is. Yeah. Okay. Well, with that in mind, here's our agenda for today. We are going to start off with the review question and a drawing as usual. We're going to finish the immune system. We're going to start the endocrine system, and we're going to talk a little bit about Andre the Giant and Missy Elliott today. Just wanted to sell that a little bit. I'm going to give your quizzes back. I have them graded, and then I've got a ticket out and some reminders for you. Before we dive into our content, just a couple quick announcements. The biology board is formerly there used to be a zoology board and a BOMI board. Now that's combined in one department. They really need some people to participate for next year. And those applications are due this week, or nominations rather, I should say, not applications. And so those of you, anyone that's not graduating this year is eligible to be on the board. They do cool stuff. They organize events for the department, et cetera, et cetera. It's actually a pretty cool, active organization. So if anyone's, I should have put a QR code up actually for this, but if anyone's interested in this or wants more information, let me know. But nominations are due this week. You should talk your friend into doing it. All right, review time. So quick review, draw this diagram and label these important lymphoid organs. Do as much as you can from memory, then consult your notes. Go. Just in time for a drawing, Chris. Is it just in time for a drawing? And don't worry about tons of anatomical detail here. Obviously, what's important though, is you're kind of recognizing the general area in the body where these structures reside. You don't have to draw detailed folds of the small intestine or anything, but just make sure you know generally where these parts are. All right, so these are some of your major lymphoid organs. Remember, there's two primary lymphoid organs. What are those two? Dan, just one. Thymus. What's the other one? God. Nope. Where do those lymphocytes mature? Hold on, Dan. Well, actually, let me back up. Where are all lymphocytes created? In the red marrow of the bone. Good. And then where do they go to mature? Hands up. Oh, see some hands. Someone who hasn't answered a question all semester. This is your chance to shine. Asher, great. Thanks. Well, I'm just totally calling. You don't have to answer if you don't want to. I don't actually like when instructors do that. Okay, good. Close. Okay, you're getting there. Where do those, they're generated in the bone marrow and they go to two different places to mature. Give you a hint. One of those places is where T cells go to mature. Yeah, go ahead. Thymus is one where T cells go to mature, and where do the B cells go to mature? Michaela. Yes, back to the bone. Remember T for thymus, B for bone? Not really, but yeah, we're going to use it that way. Good. Then those cells migrate throughout the body, and these are some important tissues where they aggregate. The tonsils. Up here, we have a number of tonsils. We're going to look at these in more detail today, but these are up in the pharynx, so they're up in your oral and nasal cavities. Then you've got your thymus we talked about, right? And both an endocrine and part of your immune system as well, an endocrine organ and part of your immune system. Your spleen we're going to talk about today. And then you've got these aggregated lymphoid nodules around your small intestine, and specifically a sizable one in your appendix. So make sure that you know those general structures. We talked about a couple of them last class. We're going to work through the few more today that we didn't cover, starting with the tonsils. So we've got Dan and then Chris. Go ahead, Dan.
We have two questions. So the first one, I was just like, if you get something like appendicitis, would that like affect your, I guess your immune system in like a pretty significant way?
Effect, yes, pretty significant. Probably not huge. No, I mean you've got a lot of other places where those lymphocytes can accumulate. So I mean, people get appendectomies, their appendix removed all the time.
Like yeah, I would hear it's usually like a useless, quote unquote useless.
Oh no, it's got so many uses. Yeah. So primarily, it's important for the immune system because lymphocytes aggregate there. It also is a little pocket for beneficial bacteria for your gut microbiome. And back in the day, I'll just tell you a quick story. Back in the day, people used to get diarrhea a lot more. We used to eat a lot of stuff that made us sick, and people would get this basically digestive issues where they're just flushing everything out. And when you do that, you get rid of a lot of the bacteria that colonize those intestines as well. This guy proved to be a little repository for those good bacteria, so that when you got healthy and your guts got healthy again, those bacteria could then recolonize. Now it's not as important today because we have medicines and we have modern cleaning techniques and all this. We don't get diarrhea nearly as much as our ancestors did, thankfully. But that was another role of the appendix. So it is actually, it's not as functional in us as it is in the homologous structure is in like cows and stuff like that. But yeah, don't think of your appendix as not important, Dan. It'll hurt its feelings. Chris.
Why are over half of them like vestigial?
Over half of which? Sorry.
So why are over half the lymph orders like vestigial? You don't need tonsils or spleen.
Oh, I see what you mean. Well, it's not necessarily that they're vestigial and that they don't have any function. It's just that they're redundant. We have a lot of them around. So your tonsil is a good example too. You can. What's that?
Yeah, the epitome of evil. Go ahead.
Well, in some cases they can be, right? They can accumulate infection and
stress every other week.
Yeah, that is not fun. But they do serve an important immunological function. In some cases, they don't do it very well, or they, the infection gets too bad there. But yeah, you can do fine without them. There's a lot of things you can do fine. I mean, you live a pretty happy, healthy life without an arm, but that doesn't mean an arm isn't important functionally, right? And in some cases, yeah, they're bad news, or your appendix gets swollen, or you can have issues with any of your organs for sure.
Nothing more than spleen.
Yeah. No, the spleen is important too. Let's talk about it in just a second. Casey, did you have a question? Thanks, Dan. Did I see a hand up over here? Dan, go ahead.
So we were talking about how this essentially that the fault is a part of the aggregated lymphoid nodules.
Boom. All right, let's talk about the tonsils. The tonsils are these tissues, and their underlying layer, you don't need to know the lamina propria, so that's the layer of tissue there, consists of MALT. MALT stands for mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, right? And so we have these MALT or mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue in the tonsils. Also, we're going to see what's called these Peyer's patches in your small intestines and other areas. So just break this down a little bit. So they're mucosa associated. So mucosa refers to mucous membranes. So this means like the gooey epithelial layers of your body that you find like in your oral cavity or your small intestines, etc. They're and then they're lymphoid tissues. So these are tissues where these lymphocytes accumulate to fight off infection. You've got a whole bunch of them. I'm not going to ask you to know all of them, but I do want you to know these three different groups. The pharyngeal tonsils, which are back kind of almost closer to the ear, the palatine tonsil, which is the ones that are most often problematic. Chris, I'm guessing this is the one that was giving you some grief, your palatine fossils. And then you have lingual tonsils, which are in the inferior most region of your tongue, way in the back there. The palatine tonsils are the ones when they say open your mouth and say, that's at least one of the things they're looking at. The other ones you can't really see very well from just an open mouth. And if you look at, let's see here. Yeah, if you look at your mouth, like if this was an open mouth, like looking at you, like this, you'd kind of see this structure. You'd have those nasal pharyngeal tonsil up top here. You have these tubal tonsils on either side, and then you have these palatine tonsils a little bit lower here, and then the lingual tonsil on the back of the tongue there. Don't worry about the cell layer. I wanted to show you the histology just to take a look at it, but I'm not going to ask you to identify those. I just want you to know that the tonsils are include this MALT tissue, and that you have a bunch of them located kind of throughout the oral and nasal cavities there. Yeah, go ahead, Chris. Generally, most often with a tonsillectomy, they're taking out your two palatine tonsils. Yeah. This is a nice one. This is the diagram that shows the three sets that I'd like you to know, and it shows you what it looks like in an open mouth. And what looks like a rather painful depression stick there, pushing the tongue down. It seems like they could have done that without so much force, but there you go. Look at that. I didn't even realize these words were on there, and I just said it. And that's all I really want to talk about with the tonsils. They're important sites where these lymphocytes accumulate, and they're used to fight infection. And you can see why they would be in the mouth and near the nose, because that's where a bunch of stuff is coming in your body. And so that's where potentially infectious agents are going to enter when you inhale or when you drink or eat. Now, with that in mind, if those infectious agents get past those and travel through the digestive system, they can get down into your intestines. And that's why we have these aggregated lymphoid nodules in the small intestine, as well as the appendix. And so these guys are also MALT, mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, and they are similar to your tonsils, but they're in the walls of your intestines, and they're derived from, well, don't worry about it. We didn't really talk about embryonic derivations in here, but they're from the mesoderm, as are your spleen and your lymph nodes. And their job is basically to fight invading bacteria, and they also are important in generating a lot of these memory lymphocytes. So remember, these memory lymphocytes are lymphocytes that are specific to a particular invading pathogen, like a bacteria or a virus. And they basically hang out in your body ready and waiting for those infectious agents to come back into your body. And when they do, these lymphocytes are ready to mount this rapid and strong attack so that you don't get an infection. They're the important basis for vaccines. There's two of these aggregated lymphoid nodules that I want to talk about, and that is the Peyer's patches, which are in the small intestine. These are just these patches that I showed you in the previous diagram. And then, as I mentioned, the appendix, which is this tubular offshoot of the cecum. Importantly, note that the cecum is part of the large intestine, right? So the aggregated lymphoid nodules, small intestine, appendix, offshoot of the large intestine. And this is basically the last, if we're thinking about the path of food going through your digestive system, this is the last of these lymphoid tissues that they would pass before they're excreted.
So I know the appendix can have like additional functions in other animals, like you mentioned earlier, like cows. So is the immune system part an exaptation, or was it the original?
Oh, good question. I don't know. My guess is that they probably performed that important immune function going way back in the mammalian lineage, but I don't know that for sure. That's a really good question. We'll have to look that one up. All right, I've got a slide here of some of these lymphoid patches. Again, you don't need to know the details here, but what I want to point out is that you have these nodules here. These are these lymphoid nodules that are kind of part of the intestinal wall. So here you have the mucous membrane of the intestine. This would be the lumen where your food and digestive material pass. This is the smooth muscle in the outer wall. We have these patches there where these lymphocytes aggregate. And that's almost all I want to say about the immune system. Go ahead, you.
So are these nodules like a lot more abundant than that picture makes them?
I don't. Oh shoot, your textbook says exactly how many you have. I don't know that number off the top of my head. So there's more than 4, but I don't remember how many there are. Maybe someone has that handy.
So is this micrograph like a cross section of?
It's a cross section of the small intestine. So you cut it. There'll be a tube pointing out at you. Cut it this way, the transverse plane. This would be the lumen, and these tissues in the cell wall. There's connected.
So are they saying that whole kind of like bubbly layer, every one of those is a lymphoid nodule? Or
Yes.
just one? Obviously,
Yeah.
there's like a whole lot.
Yeah, but they're showing this to you in an area where there is a patch. It's not like this throughout the entire small intestine, only localized in these Peyer's patches. That's a tongue twister right there. Let me just see real quick how many of those there are. Well, I'll look it up later, but yeah, go ahead, Dan.
Is the lumen the part that connects like the small intestine or large intestine, just keeps it in a bunch in place?
The lumen just means the hole in the middle of something is all it means. So the lumen of the small intestine is the part in the middle of the small intestine where food and liquids pass and everything like that. I'm trying to think of it like the lumen of your blood vessel is the part of the blood vessel through which the blood goes. All right, now I'm curious. I'm going to look this up super quick. 40. Yeah, there's about 40 of them. Yeah, more or less. Now, it varies from person to person, but you have about 40. So things can go wrong with your immune system. We could spend a whole class talking about this, but I want to just talk specifically about some disorders of these lymphoid tissues. I'm not going to get into a ton of detail here. Something called chylothorax is when this fatty lymph leaks into your thorax. Remember, you have those specialized lymph vessels collecting those fats directly from your small intestine. And if something goes wrong, those can leak into that fatty, the highly concentrated fatty solution into your thorax. And that's obviously not good. You can have something called lymphangitis, which is when these lymph vessels get inflamed. We also, the famous disease mononucleosis is a viral disease that's caused by the Epstein-Barr virus, and it attacks B lymphocytes. So it attacks part of your immune system, which is why you feel so crappy for like a month or 6 weeks. And if anyone's had mono, I actually never had it. It's not particularly fun. Yep.
Why is it like I've heard that for mono, you have like a risk of like your spleen like rupturing or like kind of exploding, I guess.
Yeah.
Not spleen, like bursting.
Rupturing,
Why is
yeah.
that so?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know exactly, but my guess is that it has to do with the fact that these B lymphocytes are accumulating in your spleen, and this virus is attacking that. So then you have this infection gets localized in your spleen. But there's probably more to it than that, but that'd be the general reason. If it's attacking those cells and they aggregate in the spleen, then that infection will be bad in your spleen. We also have something called Hodgkin's lymphoma, which is a cancer of the lymph nodes. So I should go back, I should clarify, these disorders are relevant to both the immune system and the lymphatic system, which obviously there's a lot of overlap between those. So then we have what's called non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which is when you have this uncontrolled multiplication and metastasis of undifferentiated lymphocytes. In other words, those lymphocytes are just proliferating out of control, which is what cancer is basically, is when some of your cells just decide that they want to be more important than the rest of your body and keep reproducing themselves uncontrollably. So different forms of these lymphoma, different forms of these cancers. Go ahead, Sarah.
It's like a on topic, but off topic question, but it's general, like, so almost like the ending for like any cancer that someone might have, whether it's lymphoma or like melanoma, or I can't list any off the top of my head.
So what was the,
I was asking if that like that abbreviation at the end was defining like cancer of this or cancer of that. Like I never knew OMA meant cancer.
oh, OMA, I gotcha. Yeah, yes. Yeah, so you have like melanoma, sarcoma, lymphoma, yeah.
Okay.
I don't know exactly what the Greek root of that is, but or Latin, that'd be Greek, I think. Yeah. That's on topic. That's good. That works. You're cool. All right. So that's all I want to talk about with the immune system. Again, whirlwind tour. Just want to talk about the major structures since this is an anatomy course.
In terms of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, does that usually attack the red bone marrow?
Does that usually attack the, I don't,
Undifferentiated.
right. I'm not sure. I don't know. That's Dr. Marquardt. He's your advisor, isn't he? Yeah, he's a cancer guy. I mean, he knows this stuff better than anyone else here, I think. So I'm not sure.
So do we, there's not undifferentiated ones in the red bone marrow?
Yeah, but they migrate to the thymus and then stay in the red bone marrow where they mature. But so you can find those undifferentiated cells in the thymus as well.
Like the path to it.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Yep. All right, let's transition and talk about the endocrine system. We're going to talk about this today, probably into Wednesday as well. We'll finish this up this week and then wrap everything up for the semester with an overview of your digestive system. So the endocrine system is one of two major systems in your body that's important for communication. The first is the nervous system. We spent a lot of time talking about that. The other is the endocrine system. And there's some important differences in how these two systems operate and how they communicate. Endocrine system has three basic parts to it. I'm going to talk about these in a general sense, and then we're going to get in a very, very little detail about some of your major endocrine organs. You have what's called ductless glands. These are your endocrine glands that are found throughout the body. We're going to talk about a bunch of these, and they secrete chemicals that are called hormones. We have the hormones themselves, and then we have what's called the target organs, the places where these hormones are received and where the signal from these hormones is received, and then where some kind of change is initiated in these target organs based on the reception of these hormones. So what's important here is that these endocrine glands dump these hormones into the body, generally via the bloodstream, where they travel everywhere. But they only have an effect on the target organs because only the target organs have receptors to bind to those hormones and then to basically turn those hormones into via cellular signaling cascades into initiate some kind of change in those tissues. So the hormones are everywhere, but only certain organs can actually pick up those signals. Again, since this is an anatomy and not a physiology class, we're going to focus on the major endocrine structures. I'm going to give you a quick overview of that. I'm not going to get into the details of these signaling pathways and these cellular cascades that initiate these changes, et cetera, et cetera. We're just going to talk about the big structures here. And those big structures look like this. So here is a body of a person with the major endocrine organs labeled. And we have a couple different kinds of endocrine organs. First, we have those organs that are purely hormonal, meaning they don't really serve any other role. And that includes the pineal gland and the pituitary gland, which you're all familiar with. Remember, the pineal gland is this little offshoot of your epithalamus, and your pituitary gland hangs on a little stalk dropping down from your hypothalamus. We talked about where those are in our brain section. We have the thyroid gland that we've talked about. No, we haven't talked about the thyroid as well. The thyroid gland and associated with that, the parathyroid glands. Notice that we have the thyroid as this bigger butterfly-ish shaped organ, and then the parathyroid glands are these little tiny like dots on that butterfly. Even though they're closely associated and have virtually the same name, those are two very different endocrine organs. So I want to just make that distinction clear that thyroid and parathyroid are very different. We'll talk about those in detail. We have your adrenal glands. This is where the word adrenaline comes from. These guys are these little kidney hats here that sit atop your kidneys. We also have endocrine glands that are largely hormonal, but also serve other functions. And this includes the hypothalamus, which, as you know, is part of the nervous tissue of the brain. The thymus, as we've talked about, plays an important role for lymphocyte maturation and its role in the immune system. The pancreas that you see here, which releases digestive enzymes in addition to hormones. And then, of course, we have your gonads, which are ovaries in anatomical females and testes in anatomical males. We'll talk about these guys with a brief overview here in a little bit. In addition to these organs that are purely hormonal or largely hormonal, we also have endocrine specialized cells in other organs that perform other functions, but there's specialized cells in these organs that serve an endocrine role. And this includes the heart, the digestive tract, your kidneys, and even your skin. Hormones are everywhere. They're neat. They do a lot of cool stuff. If you're interested in this, take the behavioral endocrinology class with Dr. Reichard. I think he's offering it in the fall, actually. It's a pretty sweet class that gets really into how all of these hormonal not all of them, how some of these hormonal pathways integrate with behavior of organisms. I was going to say vertebrates. I think he mostly focuses on vertebrates, though. He's a bird guy. There's a plug. Take Dr. Marquardt's cancer class and Dr. Reichard's behavioral endocrinology class. So what I want to do is I just gave a brief introduction. I'm going to kind of walk through some of these major structures and again, just give you a very gross overview of what they do. And we're going to start off with talking about the pituitary and the hypothalamus because they're probably the two most important and the two most complicated, but we're not going to get into a ton of details. I do want you to know where they're located, of course. The pituitary is also known as the hypophysis. And it lies in the hypophyseal fossa, which is in that sella turcica of the sphenoid bone. So just to jog your memory a little bit, thinking about the skull, it's that little like curved, almost cup-shaped structure in the sphenoid bone, on the superior aspect of the sphenoid bone, and that's where your pituitary lies, right? And we know we have the hypothalamus here, we have the infundibulum. We can blow that up and look at that in a little more detail. These structures you should know pretty well. Got the corpus callosum, which is of course this tract of white matter connecting the two hemispheres. We have the fourth ventricle. And then we have some other structures here. We have the pineal body. I have the hypothalamus labeled. The brain stem is down here, so you have your midbrain right there. Let's go through what are these question marks? What are let's see. You know what? Let's just keep moving. Do we want to go through these? Or do you want to? I'm deciding if I want to ask or not. I'm just going to show you, actually. Let's just do this. So the interthalamic adhesion, and I would kind of pause because this one I didn't really talk about, but it's basically, remember the thalamus is paired, but there's a spot where those two kind of thalamuses come together, and that's this interthalamic adhesion. Then we have, which other ones were not labeled there? The superior colliculus. So remember, you have the superior and inferior colliculi, also known as the corpora quadrigemina. That is on the back of what structure here? Midbrain, good. And then what else did I have a question mark on? Oh, this one here, mammillary body. Remember that from our sheep dissection, right? You all pointed that out in your videos. And then, oops, sorry. Oh, and then the optic chiasma is here. Remember, that's where those two optic nerves cross over. So these were big landmarks on your brain dissection, the optic chiasma and the mammillary bodies, just anterior to your brainstem. Anyway, that was a little bit of an aside. The point here is we're looking at the hypothalamus pituitary there. Notice the pituitary is kind of split in two. There's an anterior and a posterior pituitary. Look at that in more detail. And they actually are very different organs, and they serve very different roles. Go ahead, Dan, question?
I was just wondering, is the, where's ventricle, is it the one that's behind, no, it's in front of the cerebellum?
All right, so you don't need to know all these terms. Here's what I want you to know. I want you to know the anterior and the posterior pituitary. Of course, you know the hypothalamus already, the infundibulum here. What you'll note here, I'm going to talk about these hormones in a little more detail, is that the anterior pituitary excretes a whole bunch of hormones, 7 of them to be precise. I'll talk about what they are and their function in just a second here. The posterior pituitary actually doesn't create hormones. It's actually technically not an endocrine organ. It rather stores hormones and then releases them when it gets signals from the hypothalamus. So the posterior pituitary is actually composed of nervous tissue and is really ostensibly part of the brain, whereas this anterior pituitary is separate tissue. And the takeaway message here is that the pituitary basically controls a whole bunch of stuff in your body, everything from growth and metabolism to reproduction, et cetera, et cetera. I've got a bunch of acronyms up here before I've defined them, which is poor presentation, but I'm going to go through and define those in just a second for you. And I'm actually not going to get into, I'm just debating how much of this I want to get into. Here's how I'd like to do this. I don't want to worry about too much of the detail of those diagrams. What I do want to get into is just naming some of these hormones and giving you a general idea of what they do. So I'm going to talk about hormones that are produced and excreted by the anterior pituitary first. Some examples include thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH, which then stimulates the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormones. So what's important to note here is we have this kind of chain of hormonal signaling. The hypothalamus tells the anterior pituitary to signal, the anterior pituitary then signals the thyroid gland, which then the thyroid gland receives that signal and releases its hormones. So the takeaway message here, I don't need you to know the details of those pathways, but just know that there are these pathways by which these hormones are communicating. It's not like a simple direct signal in many cases, in most cases. The anterior pituitary also releases adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. That signals the outer layer of your adrenal glands to release glucocorticoids. So in humans, the most common one is cortisol, which is commonly thought of as a stress hormone, which is a little bit of a misnomer because it plays an important role in day-to-day energy regulation, but it does play an important role in the stress response. We also have, this figure is directly from your book, by the way, too. So you've got this. We also, anterior pituitary produces follicle stimulating hormone, which targets the ovaries and testes. In females, this stimulates follicle maturation and estrogen production. In males, it stimulates sperm production, so important hormone for reproduction. Also luteinizing hormone, which again is important for reproduction, specifically the production of estrogen and progesterone. And in males, it promotes the production of testosterone in the gonads. And then we also have growth hormone, which is huge in both development and growth, and targets your skeletal muscle, your bone, has important effects on your liver and on how you process energy supporting molecules. And then also prolactin, which promotes lactation in postpartum women. So that is just a quick overview of some examples of the hormones and their effects produced by the anterior pituitary. Again, I'm not going to quiz you on a ton of details, but I want you to be able to give some examples. And we're going to do a little activity here to think about that in just a second. The posterior pituitary, on the other hand, as I mentioned, doesn't produce these hormones directly, but they're produced in the hypothalamus and then stored down here. And this includes a hormone called antidiuretic hormone, ADH, which is also known as vasopressin, which stimulates the kidneys to reabsorb water. So a diuretic is something that makes you produce a lot of urine. Antidiuretic hormone instead promotes the kidneys to reabsorb that fluid, and what you end up doing is producing a small amount of very concentrated urine. Oxytocin is another example, And this is super important for childbirth, as well as lactation. All right, we're gonna do, I think we have time for this. Do we have time for this? We probably have time for this. We're gonna do a little thinking activity. You guys ready for a thinking activity? I can see it. Okay, so I want you to pick one of those hormones that's released by the anterior pituitary. I suppose you could do the posterior too if you wanted. And I want you to imagine, sorry, that says image. I want you to imagine what would happen if you couldn't produce enough of this hormone. What would the effect be? And then I want you to imagine what happens if you produce too much of this hormone. So what I want you to do now is just take 2 minutes on your own and just jot down some notes. So pick one of those hormones. Think about what would happen if you have too much of that hormone. Think about what would happen if you have too little of that hormone. Just on your own for 2 minutes. All right, now that you've thought about that on your own, go ahead and turn to someone next to you or a group of 3 and just kind of share what you talked about. What hormone did you pick? What happens if you have too much? What happens if you have too little?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And it also.
Good question. When you're younger, you're actually growing, it's gonna be bumping, right? This is- It is, although when you're doing, well, I actually
Yeah.
some of your bones still grow specifically. And the bones of your skull. Of course, not your long bones. Yes, exactly.
So in terms of the thyroid stimulating hormone,
Mhm.
that had to be in the HPT axis, is that right?
That would be, yeah. Mhm.
Okay.
Mhm.
Then, did we say specifically what the function of that was?
We talked about the thyroid is generally important. Let's just gonna say generally for metabolism.
Was it, for metabolism
Mhm.
and also is it iodine production as well?
Well, the iodine is necessary to create those hormones. And so if you don't have enough iodine, you can't produce those thyroid hormones, which is why they put iodine in like salt and stuff. All right, so I'm not going to bring this back to the full class. I just want you to thinking about this stuff, engaging with it, talking about it. Good job. I just want to give you two famous examples. So Andre the Giant has something called gigantism, where it's an over production of growth hormone, especially when he was young. That's why he was so tall. Also, one of the symptoms of this is once you get to be an adult, your long bones aren't growing anymore, although he was obviously very tall. But what happens is your hands and your feet and also the bones of your face can continue growing. And this is why folks that have an overproduction of growth hormone have these kind of characteristic facial structures. Andre the Giant, long live Andre the Giant, rest in peace. And the other example I want to talk about is Missy Elliott, who has Graves' disease, which is, it's actually technically not due to an overproduction of thyroid hormone, but rather when your body thinks that it's receiving thyroid hormone and it doesn't. So thyroid hormone is important for metabolism. And so folks that have Graves' disease are often very kind of jittery. They have a high metabolism. They feel hot a lot of the time. It can kind of go through cycles up and down, but it creates a lot of problems. And actually was pretty disruptive for her career. So there you go. Two of my favorite people, Andre the Giant and Missy Elliott. All right, I'm going to stop here actually and wrap things up. I want to give you back your quizzes. We're going to work through the rest of these endocrine organs Wednesday. Got a lot to talk about. But before we do wrap up today, actually, I want to go to this slide first. Just a reminder that this week, Thursday, Prince is giving his presentation. I'm going to keep plugging that because you should go. It's going to be awesome. And there'll be snacks. All right. Quiz 5, open answers. The class did about what I would expect. So the mean was about 20 out of 30. So about 68%, which honestly is pretty typical. I mean, normally in human anatomy classes, the class mean for most assessments is somewhere between 65 and 75. You guys are like exceptional often. So I'm going to give these back to you. You can see the distribution of scores here. Nobody got a perfect score. I had a few in the high 20s. A lot in the mid 20s. And then again, a little spike here in the high teens. If you're finding yourself on this end of the distribution, be sure you check this material, especially since the material that's covered on this quiz is also going to be what's on your third lecture exam. In Blackboard, there's a PDF that provides example answers for each question that would have earned full credit. So you can check that out, compare it to your answers. I left some notes which vary in the level of detail on your quizzes, but if anything's unclear after you look at those notes and look at this example handout, just let me know. I'm happy to sit down and look at that with you. With that in mind, remember that I do have open hours this afternoon from noon to 2 in our lab room. Also, just some reminders here of our end of semester schedule. Yes, this is one of my favorite memes of all time. Remember that we have class next Monday is our last class. In lab time next week, you're going to have lab practical review in your last quiz. And then the last exam will be open in Blackboard. And then next week, Friday, the 29th in the afternoon, you'll have your lab practical. Also, remember that Chase is still holding tutoring sessions every Tuesday evening from 6 to 8. The Zoom link is in Blackboard. Now is a good time to start thinking about getting ready for the final and the lab practical and all that. If you haven't yet, please be sure to complete the ideological awareness survey. I mentioned that at the beginning of class. It's in your program for Wednesday as well, along with some reading on the endocrine system and a short video, crash course A&P video on the endocrine system as well. So with that, I'm going to hand these back. While I'm handing these back, I've just got a ticket out for you with a couple questions from today's class. And I will see everyone, well, I'll see some of you this afternoon. Otherwise, I'll see you tomorrow in lab. Oh, and just one last reminder, I meant to put this up on the slide. Remember, tomorrow you have a quiz in lab on the heart. So make sure that you look over that material. You can expect to see models and or cats.